After the emperor arranged my marriage with Clayton Kenyon, a woman abruptly came to my door. She proudly displayed the begonia birthmark on her wrist and said, "I'm the one he's been searching for 3 years. Do you think you can compete with me?" In an instant, my arrow pierced through her hair bun. I smiled faintly and said, "If I wanted to compete, you wouldn't stand a chance." I covered the red mark on my wrist with my sleeve. If I didn't want to show it, he would never see it. Ding! RoyalStory reminds you to click the subscribe button in the bottom right corner to read the complete novel. I am Melina Ledger, daughter of the Lord Ledger. 2 months ago, His Majesty summoned me to the capital, arranging my marriage to his third son Clayton Kenyon and bestowing upon him the title of Prince Clayton. However, after the betrothal, the woman he had been searching for 3 years returned. She was of common birth but suddenly became the adopted daughter of the Prime Minister. When Clayton found her, he accidentally shattered a glass cup, losing his composure completely. Amidst the various gazes of the crowd, my expression remained unchanged. The town was abuzz with talk of Prince Clayton finding the woman with the begonia birthmark on her wrist, cherishing her immensely. He planted begonia flowers all over his residence for her and had been searching for her for 3 years, making his deep affection known to the world. When the imperial edict of betrothal came down, some even sighed with regret that he hadn't found that woman yet. Within days, stories of Prince Clayton and her spread throughout the capital. They went boating on the lake and painted together. He solved 100 riddles for her, just to win a prize. It seemed that I had become a redundant joke in this story. When Sabrina Hobson came to my door, her face was full of pride as she showed me the begonia birthmark on her wrist, the size of a copper coin and blood red. "Miss Ledger, I am the one he's been searching for 3 years. I advise you to back down gracefully and save some face for yourself." "What if I don't?" I asked while cleaning my arrow. "The prince has been looking for me for 3 years. His heart only belongs to me, and he doesn't like you. If you marry him, you won't be happy. Why do you insist on being the third wheel between us?" Her words would have been devastating to most young ladies. Marriages in noble families have always been about weighing pros and cons. What does love or happiness have to do with it? She was stunned for a moment, seemingly choked by my words. "But he only has eyes for me. If you don't know your place, you'll end up as an abandoned wife, your reputation in tatters. You can't compete with me." She looked at me confidently, probably thinking she had the upper hand. "Is that so?" I asked carelessly while aiming at the target. She was still smug, but in the next moment, I suddenly turned around, and the arrow that was aimed at the target was now pointed directly at her. The arrow whistled through the air, and she fell to the ground, her black hair scattered. I walked slowly towards her, bent down to grip her chin, and said with a light laugh, "If I wanted to compete, you wouldn't stand a chance. This is just a small lesson. I hope you'll mind your manners in the future. Otherwise, next time, the arrow won't just go through your hair bun, but your head." Seeing her eyes full of fear and her face pale, I finally let go, satisfied. After she left, I took the handkerchief handed to me by my maid and slowly wiped my hands. When I wiped the red mark on the inside of my wrist, I lowered my eyes slightly and casually covered it with my sleeve. When Clayton came looking for me in a rage, I wasn't surprised at all. I just lowered my head and drank my tea. Behind him was a pitiful-looking Sabrina Hobson, but there were several handprints on her fair face. After a moment's thought, it became clear if she didn't look more pitiful, how could she move people's hearts? He came in furiously, followed by guards, seemingly determined to seek justice for her. "Melina Ledger, do you know that she is someone precious to me?" he questioned angrily. I responded indifferently, "I know." "Then how dare you hurt her?" He said this with even more anger, as if he felt I was challenging him. Seeing him so flustered, I couldn't help but laugh. "You mean those handprints?" "I'm afraid you'll have to ask her about that." He obviously didn't believe me. Instead, he raised his hand, signaling the guards to surround me and put their swords to my maid's throat. With a cold gaze, he said, "You think her status is low, so you can bully and humiliate her at will. But I will never let anyone who bullies or insults her go unpunished. I will make them pay for everything." I sneered, "Pay back? Do you want to slap me too? Then he turned to Sabrina and said softly, Sabrina, however she hit you, you hit her back the same way. If she dares to move, I will kill her maid. Under his gaze, Sabrina seemed to gain confidence. She walked towards me slowly, her eyes still timid but with a hint of smugness and provocation in their depths. She raised her hand high, a smile on her lips, but in the next moment, a cry of surprise rang out. My maid had grabbed the sword hilt and put the blade to Sabrina's throat. Sabrina hugged her arm, crying out in pain, but not daring to move recklessly. Perhaps she thought I really wouldn't dare to act, to defy my so-called fiancé. But she forgot that I grew up in the northern borderlands and never learned the ways of the capital's well-bred young ladies. Meeting his shocked gaze, I smiled and said, I forgot to tell you, my maid was also trained in the military camps. There was a faint scrutiny in his eyes. I sat down casually and sneered, when I was guarding the northern border with my father and brothers, I never missed a shot. Deer in the wilderness, geese in the sky, there was nothing I couldn't hit. If I had wanted to kill her, would she have only messed up her hair? As for those slaps, if you really believe that, I can only say that despite your high position, you're a fool. Barbaric woman, utterly uncultured, unworthy of being my princess, he said coldly, his eyes narrowed. Then he bent down to pick up Sabrina and left. Watching their retreating figures, I called out loudly, You're right, I am such a barbaric woman. In the future, I will torment her every day. After everyone had left, my maid frowned and asked in confusion, Miss, why didn't you tell him that you're actually? I raised my hand slightly, and she stopped the words that were about to come out of her mouth. 2 months ago at the imperial banquet, the emperor personally arranged my marriage to Clayton Kenyon. At that time, he had already written his displeasure on his face. After accepting the imperial decree, he told me that the only wife in his heart was the woman he met 3 years ago. He would never treat me as an equal partner or share a deep connection with me. Unexpectedly, I didn't even listen to him finish before riding away on horseback, leaving him in the dust. And now, we've come to crossing swords. The news of him leaving with Sabrina spread, instantly becoming the talk of the capital. In the following months, everyone knew that the Prince Clayton had deep feelings for the Prime Minister's adopted daughter, treasuring her above all else. Everyone laughed at how I, raised on the frontier, was uncouth and ill-mannered, unable to win the Prince Clayton's heart, and already neglected before even getting married. In the tea house, all these comments reached my ears. I encountered Sabrina again. Beside her were daughters from other minor officials' families, flattering her, saying that the Prince Clayton's love for her was as strong as gold, and that she would surely be blessed with great fortune in the future. She seemed to be enjoying it very much. But the moment she saw me, the smile on her face came to an abrupt halt. The other girls around her seemed to have heard of my past exploits as well, and hurriedly left. This time, Sabrina was a bit more composed. She twirled the jade bracelet on her wrist, looking at me meaningfully with a faint smile on her lips. The prince took me to pay respects to his mother. This is the bracelet she gave me, she said slowly, observing my reaction. Although she tried to control it, the pride in her eyes was impossible to suppress. She was declaring to me her unique position in Clayton's heart. After listening, I casually put down my teacup and said, The Prime Minister brought you back hoping you could be of use, not to gain some useless empty title as you have now. What do you mean by that? I don't understand, she said, a flash of panic crossing her face before she regained her composure. What the Prime Minister wants is for you to ruin my marriage with Clayton, to become the mistress of the Prince Clayton's mansion. But from the looks of it now, you seem incapable. Who knows, you might become a discarded pawn any day. I lowered my gaze slightly, speaking lightly, but it caused her eyes to change subtly. What do you know? She asked. I know that the girl Clayton has been searching for these past 3 years, the one with a begonia birthmark on her wrist, isn't you? The moment I finished speaking, she slowly stood up, but her legs were unsteady, and she fell back into her seat. All her past arrogance and pride were gone, replaced only by fear and unease. If Clayton finds out you're a fraud, that you're not the one who saved him 3 years ago, will he still treat you the same way? You've deceived him to this extent. When the time comes, he too will become the laughingstock of the court. What awaits you then will be nothing but his fury. What else do you know? Deep fear welled up in her eyes. The world only knew that the Prince Clayton was frantically searching for a girl with a begonia birthmark on her wrist, but they didn't know she was his savior. Sabrina's fear stemmed from this, because I knew too many details, making her uneasy. I smiled slowly. I thought you were a clever person. Hearing this, she hastily changed her tone. What do you want me to do? What you want is nothing more than a perfect husband like the Prince Clayton, who has eyes only for you, and the wealth and honor he brings. If that's the case, I'll let you have him. But whether you can become the Princess of Clayton depends entirely on your own abilities. She steadied herself, seemingly unable to understand, and then asked, all women in the world hope for such things. Why don't you care at all? If you had heard the fluttering of banners and the beating of war drums, if you had seen spears piercing the air and arrows flying through the clouds, you would know that in this world, there are paths beyond just living for a husband and fighting in the inner court. I stood at the high point of the tea house, gazing into the distance. When I turned back, I saw Sabrina frozen in place. When Clayton arrived, this was the scene he saw. Sabrina sitting there pale-faced, fine beads of sweat on her forehead, her eyes blank, not having come to her senses for a long while. He thought I had done something to her again, and without distinguishing right from wrong, he berated me, his eyes full of disgust as if looking at an enemy. It wasn't until Sabrina tugged at his sleeve that his stern face softened a bit, showing a trace of tenderness. But when he turned to look at me again, his gaze was full of coldness. Melina, if you cause any more trouble, don't blame me for being impolite. Sabrina held him back, shaking her head. After they left, the maid beside me finally spoke. If the Prince Clayton learns the truth one day, he will surely regret how he treated you today, amidst his anger. He can't distinguish, doesn't recognize, and can't see clearly. Laughter came from next door. What a woman who has seen spears piercing the air and arrows flying through the clouds. The newcomer had deep-set eyes and features that hinted at foreign ancestry. Amidst his handsomeness was a natural vigor. I had grown up in the northern borderlands, where such faces were not uncommon, all coming from the northern grasslands. As I sized him up, he was also looking at me. After a long while, he laughed heartily and said, "A man like the Prince Clayton is not worthy of you. If not for those deep-set eyes that were different from ordinary people, even I might not have been able to tell he was from the grasslands. Why has someone from the 11 tribes of the grasslands appeared here?" I asked him in return. He showed a flash of surprise, which quickly disappeared, and then said, "We will meet again in the future." With that, he turned and left, his figure quickly disappearing from sight. My father, Lord Ledger, guards the northern border, neighboring the 11 tribes of the grasslands, and has maintained peace for many years. But he was no ordinary person. Sabrina's methods were more direct than I had imagined. My marriage to Clayton was originally set for after the new year. However, unexpectedly, she gave me a grand gift during the year-end festivities. At the imperial banquet, in front of everyone's eyes, she repeatedly vomited. After the royal physician's diagnosis, it was announced that she was already with child. All eyes turned to Clayton, then shifted towards me. The Prime Minister assumed a posture of family disgrace, questioning Sabrina about the child's father, threatening family punishment if she didn't confess. Yet, his sidelong glances kept darting towards Clayton. Everyone understood the implication, and the Emperor's face showed signs of anger. Sabrina, with tears in her eyes, kept shaking her head, refusing to speak, only threatening to kill herself by smashing her head against something. Those around her held her back tightly, and the scene descended into chaos. Clayton stood up and knelt before the Emperor, saying in a deep voice, "Father, that is my child." This was the answer everyone had expected. It would have been surprising if he hadn't claimed responsibility. The Emperor's face, already displeased, now flushed with anger. He sat on the dragon throne for a long while before composing himself. Eventually, he looked at me, seemingly wanting to play peacemaker, to minimize the situation. I took the initiative and spoke first. "Your Majesty, there are many rumors about Prince Clayton's deep affection for Miss Hobson. I am moved and willing to step aside, giving up the position of his princess." When Clayton looked at me, his eyes were full of astonishment, shocked by my decisive words and my willingness to give up the position of princess without hesitation. The Emperor, however, spoke up, "Melina, this matter could still be resolved in a way that satisfies both parties. But today, What I wanted was to ensure he couldn't have both. I glanced at Clayton, then knelt before the Emperor, saying with apparent grief, "My heart belongs to only one person, and I would expect the same from my future husband. Clearly, Prince Clayton cannot do this. Rather than becoming a resentful couple, it's better to stop here. Continuing this charade would only be an insult to our Ledger family and myself. Melina requests to dissolve the engagement and hopes your majesty will grant this." I emphasized the last sentence heavily. After speaking, I bowed my head to the ground, not moving an inch until I heard a response. The crowd whispered among themselves, but I remained resolute. Finally, I heard that aged voice, tinged with helplessness, "Very well, it is granted." This farce came to an end. The wedding date remained unchanged, everything else stayed the same, except the person marrying into the Prince Clayton's mansion became Sabrina Hobson. Now, one of my concerns has been resolved. This marriage was finally dissolved as I wished. No one can manipulate me, not my father, and certainly not the Emperor. However, after the banquet ended, Clayton cornered me, demanding harshly, "You acted grief-stricken in front of my father, but now you seem relieved. Were you deliberately putting on an act? Using this opportunity to break off the engagement?" I nodded nonchalantly. "You understand now, though it's not too late." His brows furrowed as he suddenly gripped my wrist, gritting his teeth. "No woman has ever dared to toy with me like this." Before he could finish, as I tried to pull my hand away, his peripheral vision caught a glimpse of the red mark on my wrist. His gaze froze, fixating on the red begonia-shaped mark, his grip tightening as if he wanted to break my wrist. I jerked my hand away forcefully, retreating 3 steps. When he came to his senses, his eyes were filled with disbelief. His suspended hand trembled slightly, his voice filled with shock. "How can this be? How can you have a begonia birthmark on your wrist?" He stepped forward, as if wanting to take a closer look. But I had already put my hands behind my back, scolding him sharply, "Your Highness, please control yourself." His face changed dramatically, he stopped in his tracks, flustered, shaking his head unconsciously. It seemed that in that moment he had realized something, but was unwilling to believe it was true. He could only stand there, staring at me in a daze. I couldn't be bothered to entangle with him further and turned to leave. The year-end festivities had arrived, and the capital city began to bustle with activity, decorated everywhere with lanterns and festoons. I also enjoyed a rare moment of peace. The Emperor's arranged marriage had been against my wishes, and Sabrina's appearance was quite satisfactory to me. On New Year's Eve, even my attendants showed rare signs of relaxation and joy, staying up with me to see in the new year, with the maids cutting window flowers. This was my first time spending New Year's Eve in the capital. In the past, when I was in the northern desert, the bonfires always burned the brightest on New Year's Eve. But as I rounded the corridor and entered the room, I smelled the scent of blood. In an instant, I swung my palm towards the area behind the gauze curtain, but the person there grabbed my wrist. Despite being injured, his strength was still formidable. In the darkness, his low voice sounded, "Indeed, we meet again. Guards, throw him out." Before I could finish, he covered my mouth, then chuckled softly, his voice seemingly bewitching. "If I'm caught, I'll say I'm an assassin sent by the Ledger's mansion." He said this with a roguish smile. "You came all the way here just to drag me down with you?" I asked. Before he could answer, we heard someone reporting from outside that Prince Clayton had been ordered to capture an assassin and was already in the front courtyard. I glared at him and said irritably, "Hide well. Prince Clayton has come. Today's coincidence is truly interesting," he said teasingly. The next moment, we heard the sound of armor and weapons outside. They had already searched to this area. The maid outside called out loudly, "This is Miss Ledger's chamber. How dare you intrude?" But those voices drew closer. Capturing the assassin is also for Miss Ledger's safety. The attendants and those people had already clashed. Amidst the commotion, I opened the door and walked out, standing on the steps. Clayton's scrutinizing gaze fell upon me. Just as he was about to order a search, I stared into his eyes and said with a smile, "Does your Highness remember the bandit troubles in Cloud Province years ago?" The moment I spoke, his raised hand slowly lowered. His deep eyes fixed on me intently, and then he said, "Continue." That day, a wealthy young man was drugged with a sedative and captured by mountain bandits. He was trapped in the bandit cave on Green Forest Mountain. His eyes trembled slightly, his brows furrowed, and his thin lips parted as he questioned sternly, "Who exactly are you?" However, a hint of panic and uncertainty could be heard in his voice. Meeting his urgent gaze, I said solemnly, "I was the one who brought him out of the bandit cave alive." In his hazy state of mind, he tightly gripped my wrist, saying he would repay this kindness someday. He even wanted to gift me a white jade bamboo patterned pendant, but I didn't accept it. Every word and sentence was a replay of that day's events. As I finished speaking, he remained silent for a long time, but his tightly clenched hand betrayed his emotions. The information Sabrina knew couldn't be more detailed than this, especially that last sentence. A white jade bamboo patterned pendant. I never thought it would be you. I saw him walking towards me step by step, finally stopping just 3 steps away. His gaze was fixed on my wrist. The begonia birthmark you've been searching for all this time is actually just a scar left from my martial arts training. My wet nurse tattooed a red begonia over it to conceal it. That day, I was wearing a veil, and you were drugged and confused, so you only remembered that. I took a step closer to him, leaning in to whisper, "Today is your chance to repay that debt." He turned his head to look at me, his eyes full of complexity. But in the next moment, he weakly waved his hand and said, "Everyone, withdraw." After everyone had dispersed, his lips moved slightly, as if he wanted to say something, but hesitated. I nodded slightly, "Thank you. We're even now. You always knew I was looking for you. Why did you remain silent? And why didn't you say anything after Sabrina appeared, using it as an opportunity to break off the engagement?" His brows furrowed, his eyes filled with regret. I remained silent because saving you was just a casual act of kindness. I didn't want any reward at the time. I used it to break off the engagement because I had no interest in you and despised others arranging my fate. A self-deprecating smile appeared on his face, his eyes filled with desolation as he said solemnly, "Melina, if I could start over, I would cherish this engagement and not mistake someone else." I turned and went back inside, leaving him in the courtyard. He stood there alone for a long time before leaving. The injured man inside, despite his wounds, maintained a teasing tone. Who would have thought that the mighty Prince Clayton would mistake his savior? I wonder what complex feelings he must have for the woman who saved him from danger back then? Watch your words. Prince Clayton is about to marry the Prime Minister's adopted daughter, I interrupted him. To my surprise, he shook his head and chuckled, then confidently said, "Wasn't their marriage arranged by you? Perhaps they should thank you as the matchmaker." Although, the truth might be a bit cruel for Prince Clayton. He knew more than I had imagined, and there was an air of mystery about him. I placed the medicine bottle in front of him and warned, "I'll shelter you for one night. Leave in the morning." The attendant led him to the guest room, and I found the token he had left behind. The totem on it symbolized the grassland royal family. He was indeed not ordinary. Early the next morning, he brazenly appeared before me, shamelessly saying that the guards outside were too strict and he needed to stay for a few days. Then he reached out to ask for his token. "Your name?" I looked up at him. He sat down leisurely, "Richard Widener." So he was indeed from the Widener clan. "In 10 days, my companions and I will disguise ourselves as a merchant caravan to leave the capital. We could take you along." His deep eyes seemed to have already seen through everything. I did indeed plan to leave the capital privately in the near future. The old emperor has been ill for too long and can't hold on much longer. Lord Ledger has also been biding his time in the northern borderlands for many years. This empire is bound to fall into chaos, he spoke slowly, but saw the current situation clearly. The Widener royal family was not to be underestimated. On the eve of my departure from the capital with Richard, a servant from Prince Clayton's mansion hurriedly came to report that Prince Clayton had fallen ill and was calling out my name in his delirium, begging me to go see him. Standing by the window, I refused, saying, "Go and fetch the imperial physician." After those people left, Richard shook his head and sighed, so rational and decisive to the extreme. Meeting you was probably Prince Clayton's misfortune. Lord Ledger had achieved great merit but was suppressed for years, curled up in the northern borderlands. The old emperor, seeing his own grave illness and fearing that the new emperor wouldn't be able to control Lord Ledger, thought of using this marriage to appease him, hoping to buy a few years of time for the new emperor to stabilize his position. Unfortunately, after all the twists and turns, it had come to this. The old emperor's attempt to use a marriage to ease relations with Lord Ledger was already too late. It couldn't warm the hearts of those soldiers who had been left out in the cold, nor could it stop my father and brother's ambitions. Early the next morning, Richard and I, along with our group, disguised ourselves as a merchant caravan and left the capital. At the 10-mile pavilion, I turned back to look at the imperial capital, knowing that I would return again before long. We parted ways at M City. Before leaving, I returned the token to Richard. But he smiled and said, "Keep it for now. You can return it the next time we meet." Next time? He raised his whip and galloped away on his horse, while I continued northward. The old emperor didn't manage to hold on until Prince Clayton's wedding day. The news of his passing spread, shocking the world and scattering people's hearts. My father had been biding his time for 10 years, waiting for this day. The old emperor hadn't named a crown prince before his death, and none of his sons had the makings of an emperor. Now that he had suddenly passed, he left behind an edict passing the throne to Prince Clayton. Prince Clayton was fond of calligraphy and poetry, and although he had talent, he wasn't cut out to be an emperor. In peaceful times, being a leisurely prince would have suited him best. Now, with this mess, he was powerless to save the situation. The great dynasty's fate was sealed. The coronation ceremony had not yet taken place when the army of Lord Ledger marched down. In the blink of an eye, the situation changed dramatically, and war broke out everywhere. I also led troops, following my father and brothers southward. We advanced like an unstoppable force, conquering everything in our path. My father, however, did not disturb the common people. He disciplined the army and treated the people with benevolence. Along the way, many cities voluntarily surrendered. On the day the imperial city was besieged, white mourning banners filled the view. Before the period of national mourning had passed, and before the new emperor could ascend the throne, the kingdom had already changed hands. With troops at the city gates, my father promised that those who surrendered would be spared. But Clayton still climbed the city wall. His gaze turned towards me, but this time, he quickly looked away. He cried out in anguish, "I offer my life to honor the mountains and rivers of the great dynasty." With that, he leapt from the city wall. Everyone who witnessed this scene couldn't help but sigh, for no one had imagined he would possess such courage. The white mourning banners in the imperial city were all removed, welcoming a new master. My father ascended the throne as emperor, establishing the dynasty as Q. I was bestowed the title of Princess Melina and took residence in the princess palace. The emperor bestowed countless gifts upon me: fine silks, brocades, and luxurious garments. My quarters were filled with treasures, and I was surrounded by a multitude of servants. He said that from now on, I only needed to be a pampered and precious princess, enjoying the support of the entire kingdom, without having to worry about anything else. But as I looked into my father's eyes, my heart sank a little. Clayton had jumped from the city wall, but below that wall was a sea of corpses and blood. He didn't die, but his legs were left crippled. My father didn't order his execution, but instead confined him to his former prince's mansion. From then on, he would have to spend the rest of his long life within the walls of that mansion. A palace servant brought a message saying he wanted to see me. When we met again, he sat there, his eyes calm, like a still, ancient well. I walked to his side, and he was the first to speak. "You knew very early on that this would be the outcome between us, didn't you? That's why you never wanted to have any involvement with me, and why you didn't want me to know that you were the one who saved me that day. Yes, you and I had our own positions. We were destined to be mortal enemies. It was best if we had been strangers from the beginning." Years ago, the old emperor had already shown signs of murderous intent. My father retreated to the northern desert to show loyalty and endured for more than a decade. But patience had long since run out, and today's outcome was predetermined. He finally smiled in resignation and said, "If I had known what would happen, I would rather you hadn't saved me back then." At that time, I didn't think about anything else. I didn't know your identity. Saving you was just instinct. Hearing this, he laughed self-mockingly and then said, "For you, it was a small, long-forgotten incident. For me, it has haunted me for years." That day, a veiled woman came galloping on horseback. In that hazy moment, I caught a fleeting glimpse. The anesthetic made my mind foggy, but I only saw that the woman who saved me had a red birthmark on her wrist, shaped like a begonia flower. For the next 3 years, that begonia flower often appeared in my dreams. I exhausted myself trying to find her, thinking that one day I would be able to locate her. But I couldn't distinguish whether that obsession was truly based on gratitude. His eyes turned towards me, but I shifted my gaze to the distance. I had never known about these things. At that time, I might have been horseback riding in the northern desert or training in military camps. Now, I was unable to respond. What he couldn't escape was the obsession he had created for himself, an obsession with that blurry figure, an obsession with the woman who had a begonia birthmark. As time passed, even he couldn't distinguish it clearly anymore. The marriage arranged by my father, I resisted it, so I was cold towards you. When Sabrina appeared, I truly thought it was heaven's will, allowing me to find her. As I spent time with her, I did have doubts, but when I heard her speak in detail about the incident at Cloud Province, which matched perfectly, my doubts were dispelled. She also took the initiative to express her feelings, and I thought it was a case of losing and regaining, of mutual understanding. So I favored her, protected her, indulged her, and in the end, things went awry beyond repair. A bitter smile remained on his lips throughout. I composed myself and said solemnly, "You misjudged people and were misled by your obsession. From beginning to end, I never wanted to be entangled with you. The debt of gratitude has been settled. From now on, whether you see me as a stranger or an enemy is entirely up to you. Take care of yourself." After I left, the great door was heavily locked behind me. On the surface, my father showered me with countless rewards and favors, but in reality, he subtly took away my military power and was unwilling to let me interfere in court affairs. Standing at the highest point of the imperial city, looking at the red tiles and vermilion walls, the splendid prosperity, I felt that Princess Melina, raised in the deep palace and bound by restrictions, was not the true Melina Ledger. So, I requested permission from my father to leave the capital and guard the northern desert. Riding with whip in hand, commanding troops, that was the free and vibrant Melina Ledger. Even though the northern desert was harsh and cold, I had never feared it. Now, Princess Melina in the deep palace, dressed in luxurious garments and living a life of ease, was like a daughter flower, noble but lifeless, deprived of the right to grow independently, only able to depend on others. I volunteered to guard the northern desert, but my father refused. He said there was no shortage of border generals in the court, and that protecting the country and establishing merit could be left to them. There was no need for me to work so hard. He said that no matter how capable I was still a woman, and I would eventually need to find a suitable husband, get married, and have children that would be fulfillment. He also said that court affairs were for civil and military officials to handle, and there was no need for a woman like me to interfere. With just these few sentences, my heart grew cold. When our family was suppressed and confined to the northern desert, what I did was no less than my brother's. When he led the army south, I also commanded troops and broke through the passes with him. But now, he said that no matter how capable I was still just a woman. With one sentence, he negated all my years of effort. That day when I requested to leave the capital seemed to remind my father. He felt it was time for me to consider marriage, so he began selecting from among the talented young men in the court. He was very attentive in choosing potential son-in-laws, picking only from noble and prestigious families. When I saw the list of candidates, I found it laughable. These men were from established families with deep roots. In his view, they wouldn't disgrace me and could help him stabilize the court. But he never asked if I was willing. Before this matter was settled, envoys from a foreign land arrived, seeking to form a marriage alliance and requesting to marry a princess of Q dynasty. They promised future close relations and mutual benefits. This foreign land was none other than the grassland tribes. The envoy had already taken residence in the Four Directions Hall, bringing with them herds of fine horses and various rare treasures, making quite a grand spectacle. My father didn't have many daughters, and the others were not of marriageable age. The court officials all turned their gazes towards me, and while my father's attitude was yet unknown, my brother seemed clear. He hinted at hoping I would marry into the grassland tribes. I hadn't expected the foreign visitor to be an old acquaintance. Richard Widener turned out to be the king of the Widener clan, the strongest among the 11 tribes of the grasslands, unrivaled by the others. The envoy presented a letter to my father, expressing their wish to seek the hand of Princess Melina of Q dynasty for their king. Immediately, discussions erupted throughout the court and palace. When I met Richard, he was wearing foreign formal attire, standing with his hands behind his back, exuding a regal aura. Though young, his presence was no less commanding than my father's. Richard smiled faintly, his eyes bright as he looked at me. "May I have the honor of Princess Melina's hand in marriage?" I raised my eyes to look at him. "What if I refuse?" He slowly walked closer, saying in a deep voice, "Our first meeting was not in this bustling capital, but in the northern desert. That day, you led a caravan out of trouble through wind and snow. Everyone says women from the Central Plains are like delicate flowers in a greenhouse, but you were like a bamboo in the snow, unyielding and resilient. So it was that early, I concealed my surprise." He looked at me and continued, "When Lord Ledger was stationed in the north, there was an invincible battle formation in the army known to all. Yet few knew it was your creation. You followed your father and brothers to lead troops southward, directly threatening the imperial capital. But they only wanted to clip your wings, to make you a bird in a cage noble and precious, but with your pride and ambition worn away, step by step turning you into a parasite flower in the deep palace. Then marrying you into a noble family, binding you with their rules, restricting you with the 3 obediences and 4 virtues. Until year after year, you become no different from those women in the inner courts." Hearing this, my hand tightened slightly, my gaze turning cold. Even the old story of the battle formation, he knew. After calming down, I looked up at him and sneered, "The Widener clan is the strongest on the grasslands, ambitious and aiming to unite the 11 tribes. Is your proposal today also part of your ambition?" As I finished speaking, he actually smiled, then said with determination, "To say so is to underestimate both me and you. I propose simply because it's you." I remained silent and turned to leave. As I did, he called out behind me, "Melina Ledger, your father and brothers are wary of you, suppressing you, wanting to bury all your achievements under their fame, wanting to bind you with the rules of this world. But I, Richard Widener, will not fear your brilliance, will not clip your wings. I wish for you to become the most dazzling pearl of the grasslands, to stand beside me as equals, to grow old together hand in hand. The Widener royal token is my betrothal gift to you." My steps halted, but I didn't turn back. His words kept echoing in my mind, impossible to dismiss. In my chambers, I found the token he had left earlier, but it felt as heavy as 1,000 pounds. 3 days later, I knelt before my father and agreed to marry Richard. Father ordered the Ministry of Rights to handle the related matters. When the bright red wedding dress was sent to my palace, I was still somewhat in a daze. But compared to marrying into a noble family and spending the rest of my life confined in those inner courts, bound by elaborate etiquette, I preferred this choice. When selecting palace maids to accompany me, I saw a familiar face. She volunteered, kneeling before me, "Your Highness once said there are more paths in this world than just the struggles of the inner court. I also wants to follow you to see them." Sabrina's gaze was determined, full of longing. She was very different now from before. After that palace coup, she had disappeared, but I didn't expect her to be hiding in the palace. Looking at her resolute face, I said softly, "Since you want to follow me, I should tell you some old matters first, to avoid future misunderstandings. Back then, the former Prime Minister intended to disrupt the marriage alliance between the Ledger family and Prince Clayton, so he went to great lengths to find a beautiful woman. I deliberately let him know about the old incident in Cloud Province, including the details, but I didn't expect the person he later chose would be you." She looked surprised, then replied, "Your Highness is forthright. But I became the impersonator also because I'm from Cloud Province, also a victim of the bandit troubles back then. So that's why Clayton believed it. I couldn't help but ask, that day you were pregnant, afterwards." She said softly, "It was just medicine to create false pregnancy symptoms. As a pawn of the former Prime Minister, I initially provoked and framed you everywhere, just to force you to break off the engagement. But later at the tea house meeting, I knew you wanted to use me to break off the engagement, which was also the former Prime Minister's goal. I had to take a risk. Later, when Prince Clayton learned the truth, he despised me. Then the palace coup happened, the former Prime Minister died, and I was finally free. The grasslands are not as prosperous as here. Have you thought it through? I asked gently. I'm willing to follow you, with no regrets in this life. I reached out and helped her up. On the day of the wedding procession, my elder brother looked relieved yet full of reluctance as he said, "Go. With your abilities and skills, you'll carve out your own place in that grassland royal court. And the Q dynasty will always be your backup." In his view, this was the most perfect ending, avoiding future conflicts that would hurt one of us. I bowed deeply. Farewell, Crown Prince brother. Richard came to escort me personally, riding a tall horse, looking gallant and spirited. The wedding was held at the Widener Royal Court. Richard and I stood by the royal tent, watching the bonfires blaze and people singing and dancing. I couldn't help but ask, how do you know the Central Plains language and various cultures so well? Except for your deep-set features, you seem like a genuine Central Plains person in every way. Because my mother was a woman from the Central Plains. She brought those things here, so many in the Widener clan are like me. I pondered for a moment, then said, she must have been remarkable. Richard took my hand, and at a whistle, a fine horse came galloping. He took me horseback riding across the wilderness, gazing into the distance at the vast expanse of sky and earth. I turned back to him and said, uniting the 11 tribes of the grasslands will eventually be our achievement. He smiled and sighed softly, then said gently, is there nothing in your heart besides achievements? What else is there? I asked reflexively. My heart delights in you, do you know? His voice was tender, echoing in my ears. I lowered my head and smiled. In the distance, the bonfire blazed brightly.